felt pity for his disappointment, but did not for a moment regret her refusal, or have the slightest desire to see him ever again. She was saddened when she thought of her family. Her father enjoyed laughing at Kitty's and Lydia's foolishness so much that he never attempted to control his two youngest daughters, and her mother, whose own behaviour was far from correct, was completely unaware that anything was wrong. And poor Jane! It now appeared that Bingley's affection had been sincere, and Jane's disappointment had been indirectly caused by the behaviour of her own near relations. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth said goodbye to her friend Charlotte, feeling sorry to leave her with such a husband. But Charlotte, although regretting the departure of her visitors, appeared quite content with her domestic arrangements. Mr. Collins took care to say to Elizabeth before she left, "I do hope, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that you will be as happy in marriage as I am. My dear Charlotte and I have one mind and one way of thinking. We seem to be made for each other." "It is most fortunate when that is the case," was all that Elizabeth could safely reply. By midday she had arrived in London, where she had arranged to stay a few days at her aunt's house. There was, however, no opportunity to discuss Mr. Darcy's letter with Jane until they both reached Longbourn again at the end of the week. It was pleasant to be at home again, but Elizabeth was very conscious of her younger sister's silliness. They were full of the sad news they had just heard, that the regiment was leaving Meryton in 2 weeks' time, and would be staying for the summer in Brighton, a holiday town on the south coast. Lydia and her mother were trying hard to persuade Mr. Bennet to take them to Brighton too, for several months, as the summer would be so miserable in Hertfordshire without the officers. Fortunately, Elizabeth felt sure her father would not agree to this foolish idea. When she and Jane were alone, she told her sister about Darcy's proposal of marriage. Jane was astonished, but soon her sisterly feelings made her think it quite natural, and her kind heart felt pity for Darcy's disappointment. However, when she heard about George Wickham's wickedness, as explained in Darcy's letter, she was deeply shocked. After some discussion, the sisters decided not to tell anyone what they knew about Wickham, as he would soon be leaving Meryton in any case. Elizabeth felt greatly relieved by this conversation. She had got rid of 2 of her secrets, and was certain of a willing listener in Jane whenever she might wish to talk again of either. But she dared not tell the third, and explain to Jane how sincere Bingley's feelings for her had been. She could see that Jane was not happy, because of her continued warm affection for Bingley. However, there seemed little chance of Bingley marrying her now, and Elizabeth did not want to deepen Jane's feelings of regret for her lost happiness. Chapter 9. Elizabeth in Derbyshire. During the week before the regiment's departure, all the young ladies in the Meryton area became extremely depressed. Only the 2 elder Miss Bennets were still able to eat, drink, sleep, and lead a normal life. They were often scolded by Kitty and Lydia, who could not understand such hard-heartedness.
"How shall we manage without the officers?"
they cried miserably.
"How can you smile like that, Lizzie?"
Their affectionate mother shared all their sadness.
"I remember when Colonel Miller's regiment went away 25 years ago," she said. "I thought my heart was broken." "I'm sure mine will be broken," said Lydia. "If we could only go to Brighton," said Mrs. Bennet. "I'm certain a little sea-bathing would be good for me." "Oh, yes, but Papa is so disagreeable about it."
Elizabeth tried not to listen, but could not help seeing the justice of Darcy's objections to her family. But soon Lydia's bitterness changed to absolute delight when she received an invitation from Colonel Forster's wife to accompany her to Brighton with the regiment. Mrs. Forster was a very young woman, only recently married, and as cheerful and sociable as Lydia, with whom she had been friendly for 2 months. Poor Kitty was very upset at not being included in the invitation, but Lydia cared nothing for her sister's feelings. She ran wildly through the house, calling for everyone's congratulations and laughing and talking more loudly than ever. Elizabeth could not share her sister's happiness, and felt it was her duty to advise her father secretly to refuse permission for Lydia to go. But she could not convince him that Lydia would be in any real danger, and so all the arrangements were made for her sister's departure. Elizabeth thought her father was wrong, however, and was still worried about how Lydia would behave in an atmosphere of greater freedom and among the temptations of a fashionable seaside town like Brighton. Elizabeth had seen Mr. Wickham regularly since her return from Kent, at family parties and visits. She no longer thought him so agreeable. As the rich Miss King had left Meryton to stay with her uncle, Mr. Wickham appeared eager to transfer his affections back to Elizabeth. His confidence in his own charm and ability to please annoyed Elizabeth very much, so that when she met him for the last time before the regiment's departure, she spoke quite coldly to him. In reply to a polite question of his about her Hunsford visit, she could not stop herself mentioning her frequent meetings with Mr. Darcy, and her favourable opinion of that gentleman's character. Wickham looked a little embarrassed, and made no further attempt to charm Elizabeth. They separated at last with mutual politeness, and possibly a mutual desire never to meet again. When Lydia left for Brighton, Elizabeth had to put up with Mrs. Bennet's and Kitty's constant complaints that Longbourn had become very dull. Fortunately, she was able to look forward to a trip which she would soon be taking with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. They had planned to visit the Lake District, but Mrs. Gardiner had recently written to say that as her husband's business made it necessary to shorten their holiday to 3 weeks, they would not have time to visit the whole of the Lake District comfortably. Instead, she suggested visiting Derbyshire, an area with a particularly strong attraction for her, as she had spent a large part of her early life there. Elizabeth was disappointed, but accepted the new plan at once. Although it was impossible to hear of Derbyshire without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, she felt sure she could avoid meeting Mr. Darcy there. 4 weeks later, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner arrived at Longbourn, where they had arranged to leave their children in Jane's care. The next day they set out with Elizabeth on their journey. The three of them made excellent travelling companions, sharing an intelligent interest in the people and places they saw on their way, and a strong affection for each other. After visiting Oxford, Blenheim, Warwick, Kenilworth, and Birmingham, they arrived in Derbyshire, and decided to stay in the small town of Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had lived before her marriage. Elizabeth discovered that Mr. Darcy's house, Pemberley, was only 8 kilometres away from Lambton. "I often used to go to Pemberley when I was younger," said Mrs. Gardiner. "Wouldn't you like to see it, Lizzie? We could go tomorrow. It's a beautiful place. Wickham spent his youth there, you know." I am rather tired of large country houses, Aunt," said Elizabeth, forced to pretend. How dreadful it would be to meet Mr. Darcy while viewing his house. But when she asked a servant at the hotel 1 or 2 careful questions that evening, she was told that Mr. Darcy was not at home at the moment. Greatly relieved, she felt able to agree to her aunt's suggestion when it was repeated the next morning, and Mr. Gardiner ordered a carriage immediately. In a short time, they entered the gates of Pemberley Park and drove through an extensive and beautiful wood. At the top of a hill, they had their first view of Pemberley House, situated on the other side of a valley, with a line of high wooded hills behind. The house was a large, handsome stone building, which appeared to fit naturally into the scenery. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were warm in their admiration, and Elizabeth was delighted. At that moment, she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be worthwhile. They drove up to the front door and asked to be allowed to visit the house. The Pemberley housekeeper, a respectable elderly woman, showed them round. All the rooms were of a good size and elegantly yet sensibly furnished. From every window there was an attractive view. Elizabeth began to admire the owner's taste in everything she saw. And I might have been mistress of this place, she thought. Instead of viewing these rooms as a stranger, I might be welcoming my uncle and aunt as visitors. But no, she suddenly remembered, that could never be. I wouldn't have been able to invite my uncle and aunt, or any other of my vulgar family connections. This was a lucky thought, which saved her from something like regret. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master were really absent, but luckily her uncle asked the question instead. It was quite alarming to hear that Mr. Darcy was expected to arrive the next day with a large group of friends. How glad Elizabeth was that their own journey had not been delayed a day. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were enjoying their conversation with the housekeeper, who seemed content to talk about her master. "Mr. Darcy is a very handsome gentleman, as you will see from the painting upstairs. His sister is most attractive too, and so accomplished. She plays and sings the whole day. My master has just sent a new piano from London for her. He's such a kind brother, he'll do anything for Miss Georgiana." "Does Mr. Darcy spend much time at Pemberley?" asked Mr. Gardiner. "Not as much as I'd like, sir." "If your master married, he might spend more time here." "Yes, sir, but I don't know when that'll be. I don't know who is good enough for him." Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled, and Elizabeth listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper continued. "It's no more than the truth. Everybody who knows him says the same. He's never spoken a cross word to me, and I've known him since he was a baby. Some people call him proud, but I've never seen any of that. He's the best master that ever lived." Elizabeth almost stared at her. Can this be Mr. Darcy? She wondered. This was the most extraordinary praise for the man she had always thought so disagreeable and proud, especially with people he considered inferior to himself. She longed to hear more, but now the housekeeper was leading them upstairs. Soon Elizabeth found herself in front of the painting of Mr. Darcy. He was smiling at her, just as she remembered him smiling sometimes when he looked at her. She looked at the picture silently for several minutes before going downstairs with the others. At that moment, Elizabeth certainly felt more warmly towards Mr. Darcy than at any time since their first meeting. She was beginning to realize that she had underestimated his character. His housekeeper's opinion of him was totally favorable, and what praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As she stood in front of his picture, she gratefully remembered the warmth of his feelings for her, and began to forget the way in which he had expressed them. As they had now seen all the rooms which were open to the public, the housekeeper called the gardener, who was going to show them the park and gardens. They were just walking away from the house when Elizabeth turned to have one last look, and saw the owner of Pemberley come suddenly forward from behind the house. They were within 20 metres of each other, and Elizabeth could not avoid his seeing her. Their eyes instantly met, and they both blushed. He appeared very surprised, but recovering quickly, approached and spoke to Elizabeth, if not calmly, at least with perfect politeness. Astonished and confused, she received his greetings with embarrassment. Soon he could find no more to say, and left her to return to the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, who had been watching from a distance, expressed their admiration of his appearance, but Elizabeth could only think of her feelings. How unfortunate that she had come! She blushed again. It might seem as if she had planned this meeting with him, and his behaviour was so different. Never before had she heard him speak so politely and so gently. What could it mean? Her head full of these thoughts, she joined her uncle and aunt in their walk through the gardens. They were walking slowly beside an attractive stream when they noticed Mr. Darcy coming towards them. This time Elizabeth was able to control herself better, and she returned his greetings politely. She hid a smile when he asked her to do him the honour of introducing him to her friends, as she felt sure he was not expecting the well-mannered gardeners to be some of her low-born relations. He certainly seemed surprised when she introduced her uncle and aunt, but took care to talk for some time to Mr. Gardiner with every appearance of interest. Elizabeth was delighted that these relations at least could not be criticised for their poor behaviour or lack of intelligence. On their way back to the house, Mr. Darcy walked beside Elizabeth. There was a short silence before she spoke. "Your housekeeper informed us you would not arrive until tomorrow, so I had not expected to find you here."
"It is true. I came early on business. The rest of the party will be here tomorrow. Among them are Mr. Bingley and his sisters, whom you know," he continued after a pause. "And there is one other person who particularly wishes to meet you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to you?"
Surprised, but flattered by this great compliment, Elizabeth gave her permission. When they arrived at the house, Mr. Darcy offered them some refreshment, but they politely refused. Mr. Darcy helped the ladies into the carriage, and as it drove away from Pemberley, Elizabeth watched him walking slowly back towards the house. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were loud in their praise of him, but Elizabeth said very little. The very next morning, Mr. Darcy brought his sister to visit Elizabeth and the Gardiners at the hotel in Lambton. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were astonished by the honour they were receiving, but Elizabeth's obvious embarrassment and Darcy's haste in making the visit so immediately soon provided them with an explanation. They observed their niece and Darcy carefully during the visit, and could not doubt that the gentleman was in love, although they were not certain of the lady's feelings. Elizabeth was delighted to discover that Georgiana Darcy, far from being proud, as Wickham had said, was just very shy, with quiet, gentle manners. It was clear that she greatly admired her brother, and had every intention of liking Miss Bennet, as Darcy had spoken of her so favourably. Elizabeth was also satisfied to see that Bingley, who was with the Darcys, did not seem particularly interested in Georgiana, in spite of Caroline Bingley's wishes, and she had to admit that she had never seen Mr. Darcy behaving so sociably and pleasantly, not only to herself, but also to the relations to whom he had referred with such disdain during that last conversation in Hunsford Rectory. Elizabeth herself was more than usually anxious to make herself agreeable to everybody, and she succeeded, because Bingley was ready, Georgiana was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. Miss Darcy, encouraged by her brother, invited Elizabeth and the Gardiners to dinner at Pemberley in 2 days' time, and when this invitation had been accepted, the Darcys and Mr. Bingley left, with many warm expressions of politeness on both sides. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were very curious about their niece's feelings for Mr. Darcy, but were careful not to question her. That evening, Elizabeth lay awake for 2 whole hours, trying to understand how she felt about him. She now thought of him with respect and a certain admiration, and was deeply grateful to him, not only for having once loved her, but for still loving her enough to forgive her bitter rejection of him, as well as all her unjust accusations. The change she had noticed, in a man who was once so proud, must be caused by his love for her. Now, since she was almost sure that if she wanted, she could encourage him to propose to her again, she only had to decide how far she wished to be involved in his future happiness, in which she already felt a real interest. Chapter 10. Lydia and Wickham. On the 3rd morning of her visit to Lambton, Elizabeth received 2 letters from Jane. The first had been badly addressed and sent elsewhere, then redirected. Her aunt and uncle were out walking, so she sat down to read them at once. The first had been written 5 days before, and started just as expected, with a description of Longbourn dinner parties and visits. But the second half of this letter was dated a day later, and was evidently written in a great hurry. This is what it said. Since writing the above, dear Lizzie, something most unexpected and serious has happened, but I do not wish to alarm you. We are all well. It concerns poor Lydia. An express letter came at midnight last night, when we were all in bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she had run away to Scotland with one of his officers, with Wickham, in fact. There, of course, she can marry without her parents' approval. Imagine our surprise. What a foolish marriage for both of them. But at least he is not interested in her money, as he must know my father can give her almost nothing. Kitty admits that she knew about Lydia's attachment to Wickham from Lydia's letters. Our poor mother is very upset. I must finish now, as I cannot stay away from her for long. I hope you can read this. I hardly know what I have written. Without allowing herself time to think, Elizabeth opened the second letter, dated a day later, and read impatiently, "My dearest sister, I am so confused I cannot write properly. I have bad news for you. Foolish though a marriage between Mr. Wickham and our poor Lydia might be, we are now only too anxious to hear that it has taken place. There is reason to fear they have not gone to Scotland. Colonel Forster arrived here yesterday. He tells us that one of the officers, a close friend of Wickham, believes that Wickham never intended to go to Scotland or to marry Lydia at all. The Colonel followed the couple as far as London, but they have not been seen leaving the capital. Our anxiety, my dear Lizzie, is very great. My father and mother believe the worst, and the Colonel fears Wickham is not a man to be trusted. But I cannot believe him to be so wicked. And is Lydia so completely lacking in morals that she could live with a man without being married? Impossible. Now my poor mother is really ill. My father is angry, for perhaps the first time in his life, and Kitty is being scolded for keeping the attachment a secret. While I am glad, dearest Lizzie, that you have been spared some of the confusion and worry we have been experiencing, I cannot help begging you all to come home as soon as possible. My father is going to London with the Colonel to try to find Lydia. I think he is too upset to achieve results in the best and safest way, and my uncle's advice and help would be everything in the world. I rely on his goodness."
"Oh, where is my uncle?"
cried Elizabeth, running to the door. But just as she reached it, Mr. Darcy came in. Her pale face and strange manner prevented him from speaking, and she, who could think of nothing except Lydia, said hurriedly,
"Excuse me, but I must leave you. I must find Mr. Gardiner immediately. There is not a moment to lose."
"Good God! What is the matter?" he cried. Then added, "Let me, or let the servant, go to find Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. You are not well enough. You cannot go yourself." Elizabeth hesitated, but her legs were trembling and she realized he was right. After giving the servant her message, she sat down, looking so ill that Darcy could not leave her, or stop himself, saying gently, "Let me call someone to look after you. Shall I get you a glass of wine? You are very ill."
"No, thank you," she replied. "I am quite well. I am only upset by some dreadful news I've just received from Longbourn."
She burst into tears, and for a few minutes could not speak another word. Darcy watched her miserably in sympathetic silence. At last she spoke again.
"It cannot be hidden from anyone. My youngest sister has eloped with Mr. Wickham. You know him too well to doubt what will happen. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to marry her. She is lost forever, and I could have prevented it. I knew how bad his character was. If only I had told my family what I knew about him. But it is all too late now."
Darcy looked at her in astonishment. "I am shocked," he said, "and sad, very sad.
What has been done to find her and bring her back?"
"My father has gone to London, and I hope my uncle will go too. We shall leave Lambton, I hope, in half an hour. But I know very well that nothing can be done. How can such a man be persuaded? How can we even find them? I have not the smallest hope. It is horrible."
Darcy made no answer. He was walking up and down with a serious, thoughtful expression on his face. Elizabeth soon observed and instantly understood it. She was losing her influence over him. This proof of moral weakness in her family was driving him away from her. Never before had she so honestly believed she could have loved him, as now, when mutual affection must be impossible. But she could not think for long of herself, when Lydia's situation was so desperate. Mr. Darcy left almost immediately, politely regretting that Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle would not, in the circumstances, be able to come to dinner at Pemberley that day, and again expressing his sympathy. When Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner entered the room, Elizabeth hurriedly explained everything to them, and was greatly relieved when they agreed to leave at once to return to Longbourn. Their packing was done at great speed, and soon they were in the carriage, driving south.
"Lizzie," began Mrs. Gardiner, "I cannot believe that Wickham's character is so bad that he would run away with Lydia and not marry her. Do you really think he is capable of that?" "My dear aunt, Jane and I both know that he has neither honesty nor honour. He has falsely accused Mr. Darcy, and has lied wickedly about the whole Darcy family. You saw what a shy, gentle girl Miss Darcy is, but he had described her as proud, disagreeable, and disdainful." "But does Lydia know nothing of this?"
"Oh, no, that is the worst of all. I didn't know the truth myself until my visit to Kent, and when I returned and told Jane, she and I decided not to make our knowledge public. Now I know that was a mistake. I never thought that Lydia could be in any danger from him." When they arrived at Longbourn, Elizabeth and her aunt were able to help Jane in looking after the children. They also attempted to calm Mrs. Bennet, who, however, refused to be calmed, and blamed everyone except herself for the disaster.
"If only I had been allowed to take the family to Brighton, this would not have happened. Poor dear Lydia had no one to take care of her. Why did those Forsters ever let her go out of their sight? I am sure they neglected her. Of course, I did not want her to go to Brighton, but nobody took any notice of me as usual. And now Mr. Bennet has gone to London, and I'm sure he'll fight Wickham, and then he'll be killed, and then the Collinses will turn us out of the house before he's cold in his grave."
"Do not worry, sister," said Mr. Gardiner kindly. "I'm going to London tomorrow to help my brother-in-law."
"Oh, thank you, my dear brother," replied Mrs. Bennet. "Make sure you find Lydia and Wickham, and if they are not married yet, make them marry. And tell Lydia they mustn't wait for wedding clothes, but she shall have as much money as she wants to buy them after they are married. And keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him what a dreadful state I am in, so ill that I can get no rest by night or by day. And tell Lydia not to buy any clothes until she's seen me, because she doesn't know the best shops. Oh, brother, how kind you are! I hope you will manage everything."
The next day, Mr. Gardiner travelled to London as he had promised. Now began a painful period of waiting for those left at Longbourn. They became even more anxious as news came from Meryton of Wickham's lies, debts, and secret attachments to most of the servant girls in the town. Everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world, and protested that they had always distrusted his great charm and appearance of goodness. Although Elizabeth did not believe half of these stories, she believed enough to feel sure that her sister's reputation was already lost, and even Jane almost despaired of receiving good news. In a few days' time, they were relieved to receive a letter from Mr. Gardiner, but unfortunately it only informed them that Wickham and Lydia had not yet been found. Apparently, Wickham had left gambling debts of over £1,000 behind him in Brighton. Mr. Bennet was returning home the following day, leaving his brother-in-law in London to continue the search. When she heard this, Mrs. Bennet did not show as much satisfaction as her children expected, considering the anxiety she had previously expressed for her husband's safety.
"What? Is he coming home without poor Lydia?" she cried. "And who will fight Wickham and make him marry her?"
Mrs. Gardiner took the opportunity of Mr. Bennet's return to go back to London herself with her children. She was still longing to know how Elizabeth's relationship with Darcy had developed, but Elizabeth had not once mentioned his name, so her aunt did not dare to ask any direct questions. When Mr. Bennet arrived home, he appeared as calm as ever, but in a conversation with Elizabeth, he admitted that he felt to blame for Lydia's elopement. "I know I should have had more control over her," he said. "And Lizzie, you were right. I should never have let her go to Brighton." Kitty, who was listening, said,
"Papa, if I ever went to Brighton, I'd behave much better than Lydia has done."
"You go to Brighton?" cried her father. "I would not trust you within 20 kilometres of the place for £50. No, Kitty, I have at last learned to be cautious, and you will feel the effects of it. No officer may ever enter the house again, or even pass through the village, and balls will be absolutely forbidden unless you dance only with your sisters." Kitty, taking these threats seriously, began to cry. "Well, well," said he, "don't make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, I'll take you to the theatre at the end of that time." 2 days later, the news for which they had all been waiting so anxiously arrived. Mr. Gardiner's letter informed them that Wickham and Lydia had been found, but that they were not married. However, certain financial arrangements had been made with Wickham. Mr. Bennet was asked to pay Lydia £100 a year, as well as arranging for her to inherit her equal share of the £5,000 which the Bennet girls would inherit after their parents' death. If these reasonable conditions were agreed, Wickham had promised to marry Lydia. At first, Elizabeth and Jane were delighted that their sister's reputation would be saved through marriage, even to such a man as Wickham. But then their father explained that Wickham would never have agreed to marry Lydia unless he had been paid a considerable amount of money immediately. They began to worry that it would be difficult to repay Mr. Gardiner, who must have bribed Wickham in this way. Mrs. Bennet, however, had no such worries.
"He is her own uncle after all," she cried happily. "Why shouldn't he pay? My dear, dear Lydia, married at 16. How I long to see her, and dear Wickham too. But the wedding clothes! I'll write to my sister-in-law about them at once. I'm so happy. In a short time I'll have a daughter married. Oh, Mrs. Wickham, how well it sounds!"
Now that Lydia was going to be married, Elizabeth greatly regretted telling Darcy of her fears for her sister. But even if Lydia had been married in the most honourable way, it was extremely unlikely that Mr. Darcy would wish to connect himself with a family in which there was a close relationship with Wickham, the man he most justly disliked. She could not expect him to go on caring for her, as she felt certain he had done when they met in Derbyshire. But now that she was sure he could not love her, she was convinced they could have been happy together. He seemed to be exactly the man who would have suited her. They could have usefully influenced each other. His mind might have been softened, and his manners improved by her sociability, and she might have learnt from his greater judgment and knowledge of the world. But no such relationship could now teach an admiring world what happiness in marriage was really like. Instead, Wickham would marry Lydia, with little chance of happiness for either of them. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner had arranged for Lydia to be married quietly in London from their house. At first, Mr. Bennet had refused to allow his youngest daughter ever to enter his house again, but eventually Jane and Elizabeth persuaded him to receive Lydia and her husband after the wedding. It would only be a short visit, as almost immediately she and Wickham would be moving north to Newcastle, where he had accepted a new army post. When the carriage containing the young couple arrived at Longbourn House, the two elder Bennet sisters were shocked to see how unashamed Lydia was. She entered the house laughing and joking, and asked all her sisters to congratulate her. Wickham was no more embarrassed than she was, and spoke to everyone in his usual flattering, agreeable manner. They seemed to have no idea of the anxiety they had caused by their shameless and wicked behaviour. Elizabeth was quite disgusted by their relaxed, confident appearance, and determined not to show any interest when Lydia insisted on describing every detail of her wedding day. She could not help reacting with astonishment, however, when Lydia let slip the name of Mr. Darcy. He had apparently been present at the ceremony. Why would Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth wondered, attend the wedding of two people he must hold in the greatest contempt? She could not discover the reason from Lydia, who suddenly remembered it was supposed to be a secret, and she could not rest without knowing the truth. So she hurriedly sent a note to her aunt in London, asking urgently for an explanation. Chapter 11. Bingley returns to Netherfield. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of receiving a reply from her aunt in the shortest time possible. She sat down eagerly to read it. My dear niece, I must confess I am astonished by your request for information about Mr. Darcy's share in arranging Lydia's marriage. I assumed that you would know all about it. Your uncle is as surprised as I am. But if you are really innocent and ignorant, I must tell you all the details. On the day I returned to London from Longbourn, your uncle had a most unexpected visitor. Mr. Darcy came to tell us he had discovered where your sister and Wickham were staying. The reason he gave for wanting to help was his belief that he was to blame for not making Wickham's worthlessness more public, and that therefore it was his duty to assist us in every possible way. If he had another motive, I am sure it would be just as honourable. He knew that Wickham had a close friend in London, a woman who had once been companion to Miss Darcy and had been dismissed for some reason. So Mr. Darcy found this woman and bribed her to give him Wickham's present address. He went to see Wickham and insisted on seeing Lydia, hoping to persuade her to return to her family. However, Lydia told him she only cared for Wickham and had no intention of leaving him, whether he married her or not. Wickham privately told Mr. Darcy that he had left the regiment because of his gambling debts, not because he intended to marry Lydia, and that he was still hoping to find and marry a woman of fortune in order to have a comfortable income. It was clearly necessary to persuade him to marry Lydia as soon as possible, and Mr. Darcy had several meetings with Wickham to arrange financial matters with him. Finally, Mr. Darcy was able to visit your uncle, as I have said, to explain the whole business, and to insist that he alone should be responsible for paying Wickham the promised amount. Your uncle argued with him for a long time, but our visitor was so obstinate that Mr. Gardiner eventually had to agree. I think, Lizzie, that obstinacy is Mr. Darcy's real fault, rather than any of the other faults of which he has been accused. He paid Wickham several £1,000s for past debts and future expenses, and attended the wedding to make a final payment. And in spite of Mr. Darcy's declared motives, my dear Lizzie, you may be sure that your uncle would never have given in if we had not assumed that Mr. Darcy had another interest in the matter.
Will you be very angry with me, my dear Lizzie, if I take this opportunity of saying how much I like him? His behaviour to us has always been as agreeable as when we were in Derbyshire. I think that if he marries the right woman, his wife may teach him to become more sociable. Please forgive me if I have assumed too much, or at least do not punish me by not inviting me to Pemberley. I shall never be happy until I have been all the way round the park. But I must go to my children now. Yours very sincerely, M. Gardner. Elizabeth read this letter with a mixture of pleasure and pain. Mr. Darcy had thought so little of his pride that he had spent considerable time, effort, and money on two people for whom he must feel the greatest disdain. He had even had to bargain with Wickham. She could not believe he had done all this for her, a woman who had already rejected him. But the fact remained that she and her family owed him everything. How bitterly she now regretted criticising and mocking him in the past. She was ashamed of herself, but she was proud of him, proud that in a matter of honour he had been able to conquer his own pride. She was even rather pleased, if a little regretful, that her aunt and uncle had felt sure that there was mutual affection between Mr. Darcy and herself. Mrs. Bennet was quite depressed when Lydia and Wickham left Longbourn to travel north to Newcastle. But soon Mrs. Phillips brought the happy news that Mr. Bingley was expected to return to Netherfield in a day or two, and Mrs. Bennet became very excited. She made preparations to invite him to dinner, and counted the days that must pass before she could send the invitation. However, on only the third morning after his arrival, she caught sight of him from her bedroom window, riding towards Longbourn House with another gentleman, also on horseback.
"Girls, quickly!" she cried. "Mr. Bingley is coming! And who's that with him? It must be Mr. Darcy, that tall, proud man. Well, as he is Mr. Bingley's friend, we must be polite to him, but I must say I hate the sight of him."
Both Jane and Elizabeth felt uncomfortable and sympathised with each other. Jane was nervous about meeting Bingley again and determined not to show her feelings. Elizabeth was uneasy at the thought of seeing Darcy, as she was the only one who knew how much the whole family owed him in spite of their general dislike of him. She was astonished that he had come to see her, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope that his affection and wishes might still be the same. She was disappointed, however, by the visit. Mr. Darcy said scarcely anything to her, and appeared more thoughtful and less anxious to please than in Derbyshire. She wondered bitterly why he had come. In addition, she was highly embarrassed by her mother's behaviour. With flattering smiles, Mrs. Bennet concentrated all her conversation on Mr. Bingley, while throwing the occasional unpleasant remark in Mr. Darcy's direction. The only positive effect of the gentleman's visit was the way in which Jane's charm and beauty appeared to excite Mr. Bingley's admiration all over again, which Elizabeth was relieved and delighted to see. The Bennet family did not see the two gentlemen again until Tuesday, when they came to dinner at Longbourn. It was a great pleasure to Elizabeth to watch Bingley sitting beside Jane and talking happily to her, but this was the only enjoyment she gained from the party. Mr. Darcy was unfortunately sitting a long way from her, next to Mrs. Bennet. Elizabeth could see how seldom they spoke to each other, and how cold and formal their behaviour to each other was. She would have given anything to be able to tell him that his kindness was appreciated by at least one of the family. All through the long dinner, she desperately hoped there would be an opportunity for her to have some real conversation with him later. But the evening passed without any more than a short exchange of politeness between them, and Elizabeth lost all hope of immediate happiness. 2 days after this, Mr. Bingley called at Longbourn House again. This time he was alone, as Mr. Darcy had gone to London. He sat with the ladies for over an hour, talking cheerfully and agreeably to them. He came the next morning, and again in the evening. Mrs. Bennet took every opportunity to leave him alone with Jane, by calling her other daughters out of the room for some reason or other. She was hoping to encourage him to propose, but in spite of her efforts, Bingley remained charming and agreeable and unattached. But on the third day, Bingley came in the morning to go shooting with Mr. Bennet. He stayed for lunch, and was still there in the evening. And when Elizabeth entered the sitting-room unexpectedly, to her surprise, she saw Jane and Bingley standing close together near the fire. They turned hurriedly when they heard her, and moved awkwardly away from each other. Bingley whispered something to Jane, and ran out of the room. Jane could not keep her secret from her sister, and kissing her cried,
"I am the happiest creature in the world. Oh, Lizzie, I do not deserve this. Why isn't everybody as happy as I am?"
Elizabeth congratulated her sister most warmly and sincerely. At last, she thought, the end of all Mr. Darcy's anxious advice, the end of all Caroline Bingley's lies and plans, the happiest, wisest, most reasonable end.
"I must go and tell my mother," continued Jane, "as he has just gone to ask my father's permission. Oh, Lizzie, what happiness!"
It was a joyful evening for all of them. Jane looked more beautiful than ever, and Bingley was clearly very much in love. Mrs. Bennet could not say enough to describe her delight, although she talked of nothing else all evening, and Mr. Bennet was evidently very pleased. Before the two eldest sisters went to bed that night, Elizabeth listened willingly to Jane's long description of Bingley's good qualities. At the end, Jane added,
"Oh, Lizzie, if only I could see you as happy as I am. If only there were another man like Bingley for you."
"Dear Jane, I can never be as happy as you, because I'm not as good as you. No, let me find my own husband. Perhaps if I'm very lucky, I may meet another Mr. Collins one day." The engagement was not kept a secret for very long. Mrs. Bennet whispered the news to Mrs. Phillips, who told all her neighbours in Meryton. Everybody soon agreed that the Bennets were the luckiest family in the world, although only a few weeks before, when Lydia had run away, they had been considered the most unfortunate. Chapter 12. Elizabeth and Darcy. One morning, about a week after Bingley had proposed to Jane, a carriage arrived outside Longbourn House. Elizabeth, Kitty, and their mother were in the sitting-room, when suddenly the door was thrown open and their visitor entered. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. They were all extremely astonished. Mrs. Bennet, flattered to have such an important visitor, received her with great politeness. After sitting for a moment in silence, Lady Catherine said very stiffly to Elizabeth, "I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. That lady, I suppose, is your mother, and that, I suppose, is one of your sisters." Elizabeth replied that she was correct in thinking so. Lady Catherine rose and said, "I would like to have a walk in your garden, Miss Bennet, if you would accompany me."
"Oh, go, my dear," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Show her ladyship the different walks. I'm sure she will like them."
As they passed through the hall, Lady Catherine opened the doors into the different rooms, looked in, and declared them to be reasonable-looking rooms. They went into the garden in silence. Elizabeth was determined to make no effort at conversation with a woman who was being more than usually rude and disagreeable. Lady Catherine began speaking when she was sure they were alone. "You must know, Miss Bennet, why I have come." Elizabeth looked surprised. "Indeed, you are mistaken, madam. I have no idea why you are honouring us with a visit." "Miss Bennet," replied her ladyship angrily, "however insincere you may be, you shall not find me so. A most alarming report reached me 2 days ago. I was told that you, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, would soon be engaged to my nephew, my own nephew, Mr. Darcy.
Although I knew it must be a shameful lie, and I would not offend him by supposing it to be possible, I decided at once to come here to let you know my feelings."
"If you believed it to be impossible," said Elizabeth with disdain, "I wonder why your ladyship took the trouble of coming so far."
"I came to insist on having this report contradicted. Tell me, is it true?"
"Your ladyship may ask questions which I shall not choose to answer."
"This is too much. Miss Bennet, I insist on an answer. Has my nephew made you an offer of marriage?"
"Your ladyship has declared it to be impossible."
"It ought to be impossible, but your skilful charms may have made him forget, in a moment of foolishness, what he owes to himself and his family. You must tell me. I am almost his nearest relation, and I have a right to know his plans."
"But you have no right to know mine."
"Let me speak plainly. This marriage, which you dare to hope for, can never take place, because Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. His mother and I planned their marriage when they were still children. They are an ideal couple, both from respectable, honourable, ancient families, with an excellent fortune on both sides. What can possibly divide them? The desperate ambitions of a young woman without family, connections, or fortune? It cannot be. And I warn you, Miss Bennet, if you marry him, do not expect to be noticed by his family or friends. Your name will never even be mentioned by any of us."
"These are heavy misfortunes. But the wife of Mr. Darcy must necessarily be so happy that she could not regret her marriage."
"Obstinate girl! Tell me, are you engaged to him?"
Elizabeth could not avoid saying, after a moment's thought, "I am not." Lady Catherine seemed pleased.
"And will you promise me never to enter into such an engagement?"
"I will make no such promise. You have totally misunderstood my character if you think I can be persuaded by such threats. I do not know whether your nephew would approve of your interference in his life, but you certainly have no right to interfere in mine."
"To all the objections I have mentioned, I add one more. I am aware of your younger sister's elopement. Is such a girl to be my nephew's sister-in-law and bring shame on the ancient name of Darcy?"
"You can now have nothing more to say," Elizabeth said coldly. "You have insulted me in every possible way." She rose and started walking back to the house. Lady Catherine also rose and walked with her.
"Unfeeling, selfish girl! So you are determined to have him?"
"I have not said that. I am only determined to do what, in my opinion, will bring me happiness without reference to you."
"Do not imagine, Miss Bennet, that you will ever achieve your ambition."
When they arrived at her carriage, she added,
"I send no compliments to your mother. You do not deserve such politeness. I am most seriously displeased."
Elizabeth did not answer and entered the house, while Lady Catherine drove away in her carriage. She had to tell a little lie to her mother to explain Lady Catherine's unexpected visit and speedy departure, and then she shut herself in her room to consider what it all meant. Perhaps the Collinses had imagined, after the news of Jane's engagement to Bingley, that Darcy might marry her. They must have told Lady Catherine, who had made a special journey to Longbourn in order to break off this supposed engagement. Elizabeth began to feel depressed. If, as seemed likely, Lady Catherine now went straight to London to talk to her nephew, she might easily convince him of the inferiority of Elizabeth's social position. He would probably feel that his aunt's objections, which to Elizabeth appeared laughably weak, contained much common sense. In that case, he might make up his mind not to marry her under any circumstances, and to keep away from Longbourn altogether. The next morning, Mr. Bennet called Elizabeth into the library. In his hand he had a letter which he had just received.
Lizzie, I did not know I had 2 daughters about to be married. I congratulate you on a very important conquest.
Elizabeth blushed, thinking that Darcy himself had written.
You seem to know what I mean, but I think even you will not be able to guess your admirer's name. This letter is from Mr. Collins, and he first congratulates me on Jane's engagement, of which the gossiping Lucases have told him. Apparently the Lucases also think that my daughter Elizabeth might soon be marrying one of the great gentlemen in the country, Mr. Darcy, in fact. Now, Lizzie, I think I have surprised you. Could he have chosen anyone we know as a more unlikely husband for you? Mr. Darcy, who never praises, only criticises women, and who probably never looked at you in his life. What an admirable choice!
Elizabeth tried to share her father's amusement, but had never appreciated his humour so little.
He goes on to say that when he dutifully gave this news to her ladyship, she made many objections, and stated that she would never agree to the marriage. He kindly gives us this information, he says, to prevent his cousin Elizabeth and her admirer from rushing into a marriage not approved by their families. Well, Lizzie, what do you think of that? I do enjoy Mr. Collins's letters, and I am delighted the Lucases thought of Mr. Darcy. His perfect indifference to you and your strong dislike of him make it so extremely amusing. Don't you agree?
Elizabeth had great difficulty in pretending to be amused by the letter. It was necessary to laugh, when she would rather have cried. Her father had most cruelly hurt her by speaking of Darcy's indifference, and she began to wonder whether perhaps instead of his seeing too little, she might have imagined too much. In spite of Elizabeth's doubts, however, Mr. Darcy returned to Netherfield a few days later, and he and Mr. Bingley came to Longbourn soon afterwards. Bingley suggested they should all go for a walk, and while he and Jane concentrated on their own private conversation some distance away, Elizabeth found herself alone with Mr. Darcy. Taking a deep breath, she said bravely, "Mr. Darcy, I can no longer stop myself from thanking you for your extraordinary kindness to my poor sister. If the rest of my family knew of it, they would add their grateful thanks to mine."
"I had hoped to keep it a secret," he answered. "But if you must thank me, let it be for yourself alone. I shall not attempt to deny that wishing to give happiness to you was one of my reasons for helping your sister. But your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you."
Elizabeth was too embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, he added,
"You are too generous to play with my feelings. If you still feel as you did last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will prevent me from ever mentioning them again."
Elizabeth forced herself to speak, and immediately, though hesitatingly, gave him to understand that her feelings had changed so considerably since that time that she was now grateful and pleased to accept his proposal. When Darcy heard this, he was probably happier than he had ever been before, and he expressed himself as warmly and sensibly as a man violently in love can. They walked on, without noticing in which direction. There was so much to be thought and felt and said. She soon learnt that his aunt had indeed seen him in London after her disappointing visit to Longbourn, but unluckily for her ladyship, her critical comments and description of her conversation with Elizabeth produced exactly the opposite result to what she had intended. "It taught me to hope," Darcy explained, "as I had hardly ever allowed myself to hope before.
I knew that if you had decided never to marry me, you would have admitted it to Lady Catherine openly and honestly."
Elizabeth blushed and laughed as she replied, "Yes, you have experienced my honesty. After scolding you so rudely to your face, I was obviously quite capable of criticising you to all your relations."
"I certainly deserved all your accusations. As an only son, I was brought up to be selfish and proud, and to consider myself superior to others. I would have continued like that, if you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, had not taught me a lesson. I owe you a great deal for that."
"And how soon I thought better of you when I read the letter you sent me. When I realised your description of events must be true, all my prejudices against you were removed." They talked of their unexpected meeting at Pemberley, which had renewed their interest in each other, of Georgiana Darcy's immediate liking for Elizabeth, and of the engagement between Jane and Bingley. "I guessed," smiled Elizabeth, "that you had given your permission for their marriage."
"My permission? No. But I must admit I confessed to Bingley that I had made a mistake in supposing that your sister was indifferent to him, and I encouraged him to return to Netherfield to see if she still cared for him. I am delighted to hear of their engagement. He will be one of the happiest men in the world when he marries your sister. Only I shall be happier than him when I am fortunate enough to marry you."
Their conversation continued in this way until they suddenly became aware of the lateness of the hour. They returned to Longbourn House, where they separated. That evening, Elizabeth could not help telling Jane her news. However, she almost regretted doing so when she saw the astonishment on Jane's face. At first, Jane could not believe that her sister was engaged to a man she had so disliked, and she wondered if Elizabeth could really be happy with him. But when she had been convinced by Elizabeth's explanations and promises, she was delighted, and congratulated her sister with all her heart. The next day, Mr. Darcy came to ask Mr. Bennet officially for Elizabeth's hand in marriage. Mr. Bennet also had to be persuaded that his favourite daughter could really be happy with such a proud, disdainful man. Only Mrs. Bennet did not need to be convinced, although she was, most unusually, speechless with shock when she heard the news. When she recovered a little, she cried,
"My sweetest Lizzie, how rich you will be! What jewels, what carriages you will have! Mr. Darcy, such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. I am so sorry I disliked him before. 10,000 a year! Oh, my dear Lizzie!"
During the weeks of her engagement, Elizabeth was glad to see that all her family were beginning to appreciate Mr. Darcy's good qualities. Determined to protect him from her mother's over-familiarity, she was relieved to see that Mrs. Bennet respected her future son-in-law too much to say more than a few words to him. In spite of this, Elizabeth looked happily forward to the time when she and Darcy would leave Longbourn and move to all the comfort and elegance of their own home at Pemberley. Mrs. Bennet was a happy mother indeed on the day when she got rid of her two most deserving daughters. It may be guessed with what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley and talked of Mrs. Darcy. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter very much and greatly enjoyed going to Pemberley to visit her. Mr. Bingley and Jane stayed only a year at Netherfield, before buying a large house in the north, only 50 kilometres from Pemberley. In this way, the two sisters were permitted their dearest wish and were able to visit each other frequently. Mary was the only sister who remained at home, as Kitty spent most of her time with her two elder sisters, which greatly improved her behaviour, character, and intelligence. Lydia and Wickham were always moving from one place to another in search of cheap rooms, and always spending more than they should. His affection for her soon became indifference, while hers for him lasted a little longer. They were not too proud to ask Lydia's sisters for financial help during every crisis, and Elizabeth and Jane Both sent them regular gifts of money to pay their bills. Caroline Bingley was deeply offended by Darcy's marriage, but she did not show her bitterness, and was always extremely polite to Elizabeth. Georgiana Darcy, on the other hand, became greatly attached to Elizabeth and had the highest opinion of her. Lady Catherine, however, was so rude about Elizabeth to her nephew that he broke off communication completely with her for a time. In the end, Elizabeth persuaded him to forgive his aunt, who eventually forgot her pride enough to visit them at Pemberley. There remained a close relationship between the Darcys and the Gardiners. Darcy and Elizabeth were both warmly grateful to the two people who, by inviting her to Derbyshire and taking her to visit Pemberley, had brought them together.